The chamber hummed with the low murmur of shifting papers, the rustle of staffers leaning in, the anticipation of another long afternoon. Bright overhead lights bleached the polished wood, casting long shadows on the faces of senators who had sat through countless hearings. But on this day, there was a different kind of current in the air, one that whispered of confrontation. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her notes arranged neatly before her hands folded with the composure of someone who had weathered storms. Far harsher than political theater, she leaned slightly forward, ready to speak, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. And then, from across the chamber, the interruption came. Mitt Romney. Silver hair catching the light, leaned back in his chair with a smile that was less warm than it was sharp. He raised a hand ever so slightly, signaling his intent to seize the floor. The chamber quieted, and his voice practiced and polished cut through the air. "Ms. Crockett," he began, his tone wrapped in courtesy but dripping with condescension. "With all due respect, what experience do you really have to be here?" The words hit like a gavel. A faint gasp rippled through the gallery. Senators shifted in their seats. Staffers froze mid-scribble. It wasn't the question itself, it was the weight behind it. The insinuation that she did not belong, that her presence was an anomaly requiring justification. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she let the silence hang heavy, the pause itself more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. In that stillness, the clash of generations of privilege versus perseverance seemed to crystallize. Cameras zoomed, and instantly, framing the tension with cinematic precision. The clip was destined for the internet before the exchange had even finished. Phones lit up in the gallery as observers typed furiously, their fingers racing to capture history in real time. Outside the chamber, millions would soon see the moment on timelines and news feeds. The question reverberating far beyond the marble walls. Romney's smirk lingered, confident in the sting of his challenge. But those watching closely could already sense that the balance of power shifting ever so slightly. Because what happened next left even Romney silent. The chamber was no stranger to sharp words and pointed questions. But this one cut deeper than the rest. It wasn't simply a challenge about policy or procedure. It was a challenge about legitimacy. At its core, Romney's interruption carried the weight of centuries, the gatekeepers of power deciding who was qualified to enter and who was meant to remain outside. For millions watching, the question was instantly recognizable. It was the same question asked in boardrooms where young women had to prove themselves twice over. The same question faced by first-generation Americans stepping into spaces that had long been closed to them. The same question whispered whenever someone dared to break through ceilings built by privilege. It was less about Jasmine Crockett's record and more about whether her very presence could be tolerated. Crockett herself represented a shift that was both new and unstoppable. She was the voice of a generation unwilling to wait for permission to lead. She carried the strength of communities, too often ignored, the grit of neighborhoods that had endured without favor from the powerful, and the vision of a future where leadership was defined not by inheritance, but by resilience. To her supporters, she was not just a politician, she was proof that the old guard's monopoly on power was cracking. Romney, by contrast, stood as the embodiment of the establishment. His wealth was generational, his power secure, his voice polished by decades of being listened to without interruption. To many, he was a figure of entitlement, a reminder that politics often bent in favor of those who had always belonged, regardless of merit. The smirk he wore as he questioned Crockett was more than a personal expression. It was a symbol of the arrogance that had long excluded voices like hers. Across living rooms, dormitories, and office screens, the reaction was visceral. Outrage simmered online as the clip began to spread in real time. Did he really just say that? Tweets exploded within minutes, hashtags bubbling before the exchange had even ended. The parents watching with their daughters bristled at the audacity. Young activists shook their heads knowingly, their frustration rekindled but their resolve sharpened. For many, this wasn't just about Romney versus Crockett. It was about old America versus new America. And then there was her silence. that still paused the way she didn't rush, didn't fumble, didn't let the sting of the words force her into defense spoke volumes. It was as if she was letting the weight of the insult hang in the air long enough for everyone to truly feel it. That silence was defiance, a refusal to let arrogance dictate the tempo of her response. It was the silence of someone who knew the truth was about to land harder than the question ever could. The room itself seemed to lean in, even those on Romney's side shifted, sensing the tension build, recognizing that something more than a routine exchange was unfolding. In that charged stillness, the stakes became undeniable. This wasn't just about whether Jasmine Crockett had experience. It was about whether America would continue to measure worth by pedigree or by perseverance. And as the world leaned closer, waiting became clear. Her silence before her answer spoke louder than words. To understand the weight of Romney's words, one must first understand the man behind them. Mitt Romney was not just another senator lobbing questions across a polished desk. He was the product of a dynasty. The heir to a narrative of power that had been scripted long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in the chamber. Born into wealth and groomed for leadership, Romney had been handed what many in America could only dream of, a seamless pathway from privilege to influence. His education came from the finest institutions, his network stitched together by legacies of power, and his career framed by a polish that seemed unshakable. Romney's biography reads, like the classic tale of the American dream fulfilled, but one achieved with cushions and safety nets that most Americans could never fathom. From Bain Capital to the governorship of Massachusetts, from a presidential bid to his comfortable Senate seat, he wore the image of a man destined for leadership. His speeches often carried lofty appeals for unity, for civility, for a nation bound together by shared values. Yet beneath the gloss of his rhetoric lay a different posture, one less forgiving, less welcoming, especially to those who hadn't climbed the same gilded ladder. Romney liked to cast himself as a bridge builder, someone who could bring opposing sides to the table. But too often, that bridge stopped short when it came to those outside the establishment's comfort zone. His interruptions of Crockett weren't anomalies. They were patterns, the reflex of someone who believed that power was best held by those who had always held it. His words that day carried the unspoken judgment. You don't look like me. You don't sound like me. And therefore, you must not belong here the way I do. The contradiction was glaring. He spoke of the virtues of democracy, yet his actions betrayed a reluctance to embrace the full diversity of it. He preached about opportunity, but dismissed those whose pathways to power were carved out of struggle rather than inheritance. To ordinary Americans, the ones who had clawed their way through economic hardship, systemic bias, and personal sacrifice, Romney's smirk and question symbolized a truth they had long known, that privilege often masquerades as merit, and entitlement often poses as experience. Romney's very presence in the chamber is a reminder of how tightly guarded the gates of power had been. He had the resources to run campaigns without worrying about where the next dollar would come from. He had the polish of elite institutions that trained him in debate and diplomacy. He had a Rolodex of allies who ensured he would never truly stand alone. And with each advantage, he became more and more convinced that his version of leadership was the standard by which all others should be measured. That is what made his dismissal of Crockett so sharp, so loaded. To him, experience was not measured in resilience, in lived hardship, or in the battles fought outside the gilded halls. Experience to Romney was something acquired by checking the boxes he had checked, by passing through the doors that had always opened for him. Anyone who had walked a different path was, by definition, suspect. But therein lay the fragility of his stance, because what Romney could not grasp was that his version of the American dream was not universal. It was exceptional, insulated, and increasingly out of touch. He had lived in a bubble of power so long that he failed to see how much the nation outside those marble walls had changed. People no longer believed that leadership was reserved for pedigreed men in tailored suits. They believed increasingly in voices like Crockett's voices that reflected their own trials and triumphs. Romney's question, "What experience do you really have?" was not just a query. It was a weapon wielded by someone who assumed. The chamber was his arena, his rules, his game. He had interrupted countless times before. He had dismissed challengers with a practiced smile and a well-placed barb. But this time, he had underestimated his opponent. Because Jasmine Crockett was not just another newcomer hoping for acceptance. She was a fighter who had made a career out of defying odds. She had stood in courtrooms where no one thought she could win and emerged victorious. She had battled the skepticism of those who underestimated her and turned it into fuel. Unlike Romney, she did not fear silence. She wielded it. Romney believed that by questioning her, he could remind the chamber and the country that experience was his domain, that leadership was his inheritance. But what he didn't realize was that his very arrogance set the stage for his undoing. He thought the chamber was his arena, until he met someone who wouldn't play by his rules. Long before her name echoed across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett's story was being written in the overlooked corners of America, places where power didn't often visit, where families worked 2 jobs to survive, and where opportunity had to be chased, not inherited. Hers was not a life paved with shortcuts. It was a life defined by detours, battles, and grit. She began not as the heir to legacy, but as the daughter of struggle. Growing up, she understood what it meant to live in a community that was overlooked, where school books were hand-me-downs and resources were scarce. While others could call in favors to open doors, Crockett had to carve her own path with persistence sharp enough to cut through barriers. Those early years taught her something Romney never needed to learn: how to fight for recognition in a world that was not built to see you. Her activism sparked not from ambition, but from necessity. She marched in protests, she organized with neighbors, and she learned that true leadership wasn't about titles, but about showing up for people when no one else would. For Crockett, politics wasn't an abstract arena of debates and photo ops. It was the lived reality of families trying to pay rent, children needing safer schools, and communities demanding justice when ignored by those in power. That grounding eventually pulled her into the courtroom, where she found her voice as an attorney. The courtroom became her training ground, sharpening her wit, her composure, and her instinct for when to strike with precision. She defended those without resources, often standing against prosecutors and judges who doubted her from the moment she entered the room, and time after time, she proved them wrong. The courtroom gave her more than victories. It gave her resilience. It taught her to listen deeply, speak strategically, and never underestimate the power of truth delivered calmly and firmly. Those who underestimated her did so at their own peril. Crockett's debates were fiery, yes, but beneath the fire was calculation. She knew when to hold back, when to let an opponent overextend, and when to deliver the blow that left the room silent. She didn't need to raise her voice to command authority. Her presence did that on its own. Every trial, every debate, every late-night preparation session added another layer of steel to her character. She wasn't just practicing law, was preparing for moments exactly like the one Romney created. Unlike Romney, who inherited his stage, Crockett built hers brick by brick. She knocked on doors during campaigns when no one thought she could win. She stood in community halls speaking to small crowds, convincing them that their voices mattered as much as the powerful. She knew how it felt to be dismissed, to be told she wasn't ready, to be underestimated because of her gender, her race, or her background. But instead of shrinking under that weight, she turned it into fuel. Each doubt became another reason to prove them wrong. Each dismissal became another step forward. What made her dangerous to the establishment wasn't just her intelligence or her passion, it was her authenticity. She didn't wear a mask of polish that hid her truth. She spoke with the rawness of someone who had lived the struggles she described. When Crockett talked about justice, it wasn't theoretical, it was personal. When she spoke about dignity, it wasn't academic, it was lived. And that authenticity resonated far beyond the chamber walls. It made her relatable. It made her credible. It made her unstoppable. So when Romney, the polished son of privilege, tried to reduce her to a resume line, he underestimated more than just a colleague, he underestimated a lifetime behind. Her silence that day was the roar of every courtroom where she had fought and won. Behind her calm was the fire of every protest, every grassroots meeting, every campaign that told her she couldn't and then watched her prove she could. Crockett didn't arrive in that chamber because the system opened the door for her. She arrived because she had forced her way through doors that were meant to stay shut. And unlike those who relied on privilege to keep them steady, she carried with her the grounding of people who had lifted her, supported her, and believed in her. Long before the cameras arrived, that connection to the people gave her a strength no smirk could erase. Romney thought his question was clever, thought it would remind her of her place. But Crockett's place was not his to decide. She had already claimed it, not with inheritance, but with hard-earned credibility. And when he questioned her worthiness, she didn't just hear his voice, she heard the echoes of every doubt she had ever faced. She knew exactly how to answer, because she had been answering all her life. And when Romney tried to diminish that, she reached into the well of her story. The question still lingered in the air, heavy as stone, but Romney wasn't finished. Leaned forward this time, his voice firm, rehearsed, confident in its superiority. With all due respect, this chamber is not a training ground. It's for those with experience, with the background necessary to govern wisely. His words rang with certainty, as though he were the arbiter of who qualified and who did not. Crockett, however, remained still, her hands folded, her gaze level. She allowed the silence to expand, silence so deliberate it unsettled even those on his side. Romney pressed on, his tone edging sharper. I've spent decades in leadership, in business, in public service. This isn't about passion, it's about proven ability. And frankly, I have yet to see yours demonstrated here. The smirk returned, thin and tight, the kind of smile designed to sting. The room tightened. Staffers glanced nervously at one another. A low murmur rose, then quickly fell, as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. Crockett shifted slightly in her seat, not to fidget, but to settle in as. Though she were preparing, calculating, Romney misread her composure as weakness. Let me be clear, he continued, now gesturing with his hand for emphasis. This institution is not for those still learning on the job. It demands expertise. It demands experience that you, Miss Crockett, simply do not possess. Whispers echoed along the edges of the chamber. Reporters scribbled faster, recognizing a headline unfolding. Phones discreetly lifted, recording angles that would soon flood social media. Even some of Romney's allies shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, sensing that the performance was crossing from assertive to arrogant. Through it all, Crockett remained unmoved. She didn't interrupt. She didn't break her focus. Instead, she let Romney stack his words higher and higher, building a tower of condescension that teetered on its own instability. Every smirk, every interruption, every dismissive gesture, she let him own them, unchallenged, until the arrogance itself became louder than his arguments. And then, a subtle shift. Act! Crockett lifted her chin, her eyes steady, her posture unshaken. That simple motion was enough to send a ripple through the gallery. It was the unmistakable signal that the silence was about to end. The anticipation was electric. The chamber, once restless, now seemed frozen in place. Every whisper fell away. Every breath hung suspended. The audience, both inside the room and across screens, felt it simultaneously. The moment had built to a breaking point. Something was coming, and everyone knew it. Romney leaned back, convinced he had delivered the final word. But the truth was clear to those watching closely. His performance had overreached. He had mistaken Crockett's calm for hesitation, her patience for weakness. What he failed to see was that she had been letting him speak, not because she lacked an answer, but because she knew her answer would eclipse his entirely. The chamber braced itself. Even those who had doubted her now leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the woman who had sat silently while arrogance unraveled before her. The air grew taut, as if stretched thin by the weight of anticipation, and in that stillness, it became undeniable. The counterstrike was coming. The silence had stretched, long enough that even the marble walls seemed to listen. Crockett finally leaned forward, her voice measured. Low but resonant enough to carry across the chamber. "Senator Romney," she began. Her tone even neither defensive nor deferential, but rooted in quiet certainty. "You asked what experience? I have to be here. Allow me to answer." The room hushed further. Romney's smirk lingered, though a flicker of unease flashed across his eyes. He hadn't expected her to respond with such calm, such poise. Crockett continued, each word deliberate. "My experience, Senator, doesn't come from inheriting a name or from sitting on corporate boards padded with privilege. It comes from fighting for people who don't have lobbyists, who don't have inherited wealth, who don't have a seat at this table unless someone like me pulls up a chair for them." Gasps whispered through the chamber. Phones lit up instantly. Staffers fumbling to capture every syllable. "I've been underestimated my entire life," she pressed on, her gaze never leaving Romney. "I wasn't born into wealth. I didn't have doors open for me just because of my last name. I earned my place in every courtroom I stepped into. Every case I fought, every law I defended. That's my experience. Frankly, Senator, it's the kind of experience this chamber needs more of, not less." Romney shifted, his forced smile tightening. The confidence that had fueled his interruptions, just moments before, now seemed brittle, thin. Crockett's voice gained momentum, not in volume, but in clarity. "When you dismiss me, you're not just dismissing me. You're dismissing every woman who had to claw her way into these halls. Every person of color told they didn't belong. Every young leader who's been told to wait their turn. That's who you're really talking to when you question my experience." The words landed heavy. A few senators, those often silent during such exchanges, shifted uncomfortably. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered audibly, "Did she just say that?" She didn't stop. "You speak of leadership as if it's inherited, as if it's passed down like property or bought with fortune. Leadership, Senator, is not about how much wealth you've accumulated. It's about how much struggle you've endured, how much resilience you've shown, how deeply you understand the people you serve." Phones buzzed with live tweets. Crockett schooling Romney in real time. Clips were already circulating with captions like, "Experience ISNT, just to resume its survival." Romney's jaw clenched tighter. His smile had evaporated, replaced by a stiff stillness. His knuckles whitened on the desk in front of him, but he said nothing. Crockett leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough to make the chamber lean closer. "I didn't come here to be measured by the yardstick of privilege. I came here to represent people who never had one. And if my presence here makes you uncomfortable, Senator, then perhaps that says more about your experience than mine." The chamber froze. The statement hit like a strike of lightning. For a moment, no one breathed. And then, with perfect timing, Crockett delivered her crescendo. Her words cut clean, unshakable. "Experience isn't inherited, Senator. It's earned. I've lived mine." The final line landed like a gavel. Strike. For a heartbeat, the room remained still, then erupted. Murmurs, even scattered applause, broke through the silence. Phones shot higher, capturing the moment from every angle. Staffers exchanged frantic looks, some in disbelief, others in awe. Did she really just say that? Someone whispered again, louder this time. Romney sat frozen, jaw tight, lips pressed into a thin line. The senator who had begun the exchange so certain of his dominance now had nothing left to add. His silence was louder than any rebuttal he might have attempted. Crockett, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, her composure intact, her expression calm, not triumphant, not smug, but resolute. She had said what needed to be said, and she knew. It would echo far beyond the chamber walls. Within minutes, the internet followed. Hashtags surged across platforms. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Experience Earned. Hashtag Romney Silenced. Clips racked up views by the hundreds of thousands, then millions. Comment sections lit up with reactions. This is why we need leaders like her. She didn't just answer, she ended him. Experience is an inherited quote of the year. Even mainstream outlets scrambled to push out headlines. Some framed it as a clash of generations, others as a pivotal moment in political culture. But the consensus was undeniable. Crockett hadn't just defended herself, she had flipped the script, redefining what experience meant in the halls of power. And as the chamber buzzed with the aftershock, one truth remained clear. Romney had walked into that exchange believing he would remind Crockett of her place. Instead, Crockett had reminded the world of hers. The cliffhanger lingered in the air. Both in the chamber and across millions of screens, the chamber erupted on. The internet followed. The moment. Crockett's final words: experience isn't inherited, Senator. It's earned, and I've lived mine. Echoed across the chamber as the digital world ignited. Phones that had been discreetly filming during the exchange flooded every platform. Then minutes. Hashtags stormed to the top of trending charts. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Speechless Romney. Hashtag Experience Earned. Clips of the mic drop ricocheted across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, each edit sharpening the sting of her words. One viral video stitched her line with a slow zoom on Romney's tightened jaw, overlaid with bold text. When the privilege card gets declined. On TikTok, creators remixed her moment into everything from rap freestyles to lip-sync skits. Memes multiplied. Romney's stiff smile turned into a reaction gif for every situation where someone is left without a comeback. Late night comedy shows wasted no time. By evening, monologues were peppered with references. Romney wanted a resume. Crockett gave him a reality check. Audiences roared. The clip played again on national television, magnifying its reach. But beyond the comedy, the praise was serious and swift. Allies took to the airwaves and timelines, lauding her composure and precision. One progressive senator tweeted, "What Crockett delivered today wasn't just a response, it was a masterclass in dignity under fire." Even some moderates, often hesitant to weigh in, expressed admiration. A political journalist wrote, "You don't have to agree with her politics to recognize the sheer force of that moment." Crockett answered with more authenticity than most seasoned figures in this chamber have shown in years. That authenticity resonated far beyond Washington. In communities across the country, Crockett's words sparked something deeper. Teachers played the clip in civics classes, students scribbling the final line in notebooks as if it were history in the making. Young activists, especially women and leaders of color, flooded social media with personal reflections. A college student posted, "For the first time, I saw myself in that chamber. Her story is my story." Another shared a side-by-side photo, Crockett at the mic, and her own graduation picture captioned, "Experience earned, experience lived, church." Groups, grassroots organizers, and community leaders amplified her voice as a symbol of resilience against elitism. Civil rights forums hosted live streams dissecting the moment, praising how she reframed power not as something inherited, but something fought for and lived through. The shockwaves weren't just emotional, they were cultural. Late night wasn't the only stage. Buzzing daytime talk shows invited panels of young leaders, teachers and parents to unpack why the line resonated so strongly. A recurring theme emerged. Crockett didn't just clap back at Romney, she had reminded an entire generation that legitimacy and leadership comes from lived struggle, not legacy. Romney, meanwhile, remained conspicuously silent. His office released no statement that day, no attempt to spin the exchange. His silence itself became another meme. Screenshots of him frozen in the chamber captioned, "Man disconnected his Wi-Fi mid-debate." But even as the laughter rolled and the hashtags trended, the deeper impact was undeniable. In neighborhoods across the country, the moment wasn't just entertainment, it was affirmation. Parents showed their kids the clip as proof that dignity and truth can cut through condescension. Young professionals replayed it as motivation before interviews, a reminder that lived experience has its own authority. By nightfall, the headlines had crystallized. Crockett shuts down Romney with mic drop heard around the net. Experience earned. How one line redefined the debate. From chamber to culture, Crockett's words spark movement. It was more than a trending topic. It was a cultural lightning bolt, striking a nerve in a society hungry for authenticity. Tired of gatekeeping and ready to see new voices step into power, and yet, beneath the hashtags and applause, something deeper stirred. The viral moment was electric, but it wasn't the whole story. Beyond the noise, the memes, and the trending clips, a quieter, more profound lesson was beginning to unfold. But beyond the noise, a deeper lesson was unfolding. The chamber quieted after the roar, but the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words did not fade. It lingered, hanging heavy in the air, even as the formalities of the session stumbled back into motion. In that silence, something far larger than a debate victory had occurred. Crockett had reframed what confrontation looks like, not as an eruption of anger, but as a lesson in restraint, clarity, and unshakable dignity. Mitt Romney had arrived with arrogance disguised as authority. He expected interruptions to rattle her, pedigree to overshadow her, and smug certainty to define the exchange. Instead, Crockett revealed a deeper truth. Arrogance unravels itself when met with composure. His interruptions looked small, petty. Her pauses, her measured tone, her steady gaze, they expanded, commanding the room. The moral was undeniable. True strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it breathes deeply, waits, and then speaks with precision. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice to rise above. She reminded everyone that dignity is not weakness. It is the sharpest weapon against condescension. And in her triumph, a universal message emerged. Experience is not a privilege handed down like an heirloom. It is carved through struggle, sacrifice, and survival. Romney's version of experience came from halls of power, access, and legacy. Crockett's came from lived reality courtrooms, communities, fights where the stakes were not titles or prestige but people's actual lives. Her answer wasn't just about her resume. It was about reclaiming what the word experience really means. That distinction rippled outward. For too long, America's leadership has treated qualification as something gate-kept by privilege. Degrees, last names, bank accounts, and family legacies were stamped as credentials. But Crockett flipped the frame. She embodied the truth. That resilience, perseverance, and lived struggle are credentials no gatekeeper can deny. Her experience wasn't inherited, was earned. And in that moment, it became clear that the definition of leadership itself was shifting. This was more than a political clapback, it was cultural reorientation. America is changing. The faces of leadership are no longer limited to the privileged few who were born inside the gates. They now include the voices of those who had to fight their way in, voices that speak not from entitlement, but from endurance. Crockett's poise didn't just expose Romney's arrogance, exposed how outdated his assumptions were, and that shift matters. Because every young leader watching, every student, activist, or underrepresented voice who wondered if their struggle disqualified them, now saw the opposite. Their struggle is their strength. Their lived reality is their legitimacy. They don't need permission to stand. They only need the courage to claim their space. The chamber may have returned to procedure. But outside, America was still buzzing, not only from the thrill of the exchange, but from the realization that history was tilting. Leaders, like Crockett, are not anomalies. They are the leading edge of a tide rolling forward. Her words became more than a rebuttal. They became a creed. Experience is not gate-kept, it is lived. Leadership is not inherited, it is earned. And dignity, even in the face of arrogance, will always speak louder than privilege. That's why the moment will endure as a viral clip, not as a trending hashtag, but as a marker in time when the narrative of power shifted, and as the final applause from allies and whispers from adversaries faded into the record, an emotional truth crystallized. The future does not wait for permission from the past. Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had spoken for a generation, ready to redefine what leadership looks like. She had shown that the future of America is not bound by privilege, is written by those who live, endure, and rise in that chamber. A new truth was spoken. The future doesn't ask permission. Mitt Romney walked into that chamber, certain he had the upper hand. He questioned Jasmine Crockett's worth, her qualifications, her very right to stand where she stood. But when the moment came, his certainty collapsed. Her calm, precise answer left him silent, not because she shouted him down, but because dignity spoke louder than arrogance ever could. This is why that exchange will be remembered, Romney thought. Interruption would rattle her. Instead, it exposed his own fragility. Crockett showed that true power isn't about who speaks the loudest or who carries the longest. Resume, it's about who speaks with lived truth. Her response wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reminder that experience is earned through struggle, not inherited through privilege. And in those few unforgettable minutes, she reframed the meaning of leadership for all who were watching. That's the heart of this story. Arrogance was silenced. Dignity was amplified. What was supposed to be a dismissal turned into a declaration. A new chapter in American leadership was written in real time by someone who understands that every hard-won fight, every scar, every lesson lived is itself experience. And now the question extends beyond the Senate floor. It comes to all of us. Do we still measure leadership by pedigree, or do we honor those who've lived the struggle? Do we side with arrogance, or do we stand with dignity? If you believe that experience is earned, not inherited, then don't. Let this moment fade. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it forward. Subscribe now and join the voices rewriting America's story.